Welcome to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Courtney Nelson, president of City Club. For over 100 years, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people come together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and explore. We're gathered here at the Sentinel Hotel, along with all of you listening on OPB Radio or viewing on OpenSignal or YouTube. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners enables us to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. Our media partner is Oregon Business Magazine, and our current Friday Forum sponsors are Family Care Health, Northwest Health Foundation, and Northwest Natural. Please join me in showing our appreciation for our sponsors. And now on to our program. Given the uncertainty of the federal budget and the massive $1.6 billion state budget deficit, how can you effectively govern under such a situation? It's sort of like chaos. We're pleased to welcome Governor Kate Brown to our Friday Forum stage. With over 25 years of service, she has served as Oregon's Secretary of State and served for 17 years in our state legislature. In 2004, she made history, becoming the first woman in Oregon history to serve as Senate Majority Leader. Interviewing the governor today is Nichole June Maher, President and CEO of the Northwest Health Foundation and a member of our Board of Governors. Please join me in welcoming Nichole and our governor.
Good afternoon. Thank you, audience members, for being with us today in this unprecedented conversation with the Honorable Governor Kate Brown. Today's topic is governing during a Trump administration. I am incredibly honored to serve as your moderator today. In order to prepare for today's conversation, I reached out to hundreds of Oregonians across our beautiful state and invited them to submit questions. We heard from teachers, small business owners, nonprofit leaders, nursery owners, and a whole bunch of other important Oregonians who really care about our state. We heard from small towns, we heard from medium-sized towns, and we heard from communities all along the I-5 corridor. And today I have put together many of the most commonly asked questions, the questions I was most excited to hear you answer, as well as some of the questions that I felt like might help us understand some of the complexities that Oregon is facing. I want to take a moment to thank those Oregonians who submitted those questions. We heard from as far away as Vail, Chiloquin, Brookings, and so many other really remarkable communities across our state. I was reminded when I was reading these questions about how much Oregon has to offer. I was reminded why I loved growing up in the rural community that I grew up in, and I was reminded about why I love Portland and my own North Portland neighborhood. I was also reminded that Oregon is truly a snapshot of what the United States is today. In some ways, we have the same urban core that's experiencing growth and a lot of challenges that come along with growth. And we also have those rural parts of our state that haven't had as much benefit of growth, but are still facing so many challenges. And we're going to get into all of those pieces today, as well as this other piece about Oregon that is similar to the rest of the United States. We have a great diversity of political perspectives in our state. Many people don't realize that we are in many ways a purple state, and all of those political ideologies make up this state that you now govern. So to start with, I'd love to invite you to just take 4 or 5 minutes and share with us your ideas and your perspective and your strategy for governing during this federal administration.
Thank you, Nichole, and it's truly an honor and a delight to be here with all of you today. I want to say thank you to Nichole for your leadership. She has done a lot of work over the last several years, specifically focused on changing the face of our legislature and making sure that we have a legislature that reflects the diverse communities of Oregon. And we saw great successes in this election cycle, and it's certainly bearing fruit with the great great voices of Representative Diego Hernandez and Representative Janelle Bynum and that strong, young, I'll say mostly leadership class, but thank you for your incredible efforts and focused efforts in that direction. So I wanted to take a moment to recognize and honor what happened last week, and to make it very clear to the families that are hurting from last week's horrible, horrible tragedy, that my heart breaks for you and the impact that this tragedy has. In particular to the Muslim community, I stand with you shoulder to shoulder, and I want to make it very clear that in our Oregon, we are going to continue to create what I call a welcoming and inclusive state. And hate and discrimination are absolutely unacceptable. And I know for a lot of us, the November election was scary. It made a lot of us afraid and concerned. I think some folks across the state had a lot of hope. My concern, frankly, was that some of the campaign rhetoric would turn into reality on the ground. And some of the administration policies are very disconcerting to me. And my goal is, as Oregon governor, is to fight to protect Oregon values and to continue to create what I call, what Dr. Martin Luther King called, a beloved community. And I'll just take one example, and that was the administration's Muslim ban. We were very fortunate in this state. Back in 1987, legislator Rocky Beria passed a statute that prohibited law enforcement from treating immigrants and refugees as criminals based on their status. And with the help of that statute, when this administration came out with the Muslim ban, I signed an executive order reinforcing that, but also saying to our state employees, you are prohibited from treating immigrants and refugees as criminals based on their status. The other piece that we did in that executive order was to prohibit the creation of a Muslim ban. And so that is my hope for Oregon, that we will continue to unite and work together to fight back hate and discrimination and create a state, a beloved community, where every single Oregonian will be able to achieve their full potential. Thank you.
So I'm going to follow up on the November election. This last November, over 800,000 Oregonians voted for Donald Trump, as compared to roughly 1 million Oregonians who voted for Hillary Clinton. And there was actually a surprisingly large number of Oregonians who voted for third-party candidates or just didn't vote at the top of the ticket at all. And I'd love to invite you to talk about how you, as governor of the entire state of Oregon, really incorporate all of those different voices along the political continuum.
So the way I hear and listen from Oregonians is to be out on the road. So in the last several weeks, I have been out on the road to Burns, I've been to Ontario, I've been to Florence, where the rain was going literally sideways. I've been down to Eugene. I've certainly been to Medford and Ashland to hear from individuals, to listen to business owners, and to talk with communities about what it is they need to thrive. And what I love about Oregon is we all share some very important values, and that is we want to have an excellent education system. We want our students, every single student, to go to a school that they can thrive in. Number two, we want to make sure that all Oregonians have access to health care. And I know that's a controversial issue at the federal level, but Republicans, Democrats, independents, everyone in between, everyone believes in Oregon that we should all have access to health care. And the third piece is making sure that we have an economy that works for everyone. And one of the challenges, and I think we see this most in terms of the urban-rural divide, right now in metropolitan Oregon, our economy is thriving. We have one of the fastest growing GDPs in the entire nation. I think actually the fastest right now. Our unemployment rate is the lowest, it's record-breaking, it's the lowest it's ever been. And yet, in many of our rural communities, they are really struggling to have good-paying jobs. When I talk to folks in Ontario and Burns, they want their children to be able to grow up and get a good-paying job and continue to stay in Burns or Ontario or Astoria. And so that's one of the areas where I'm focused on as governor, is to make sure that our economy thrives, not just in our metropolitan areas, but in every single corner of the state.
So when you're out there and in those conversations and talking to folks, do you feel like those Oregonians who cast their vote for Trump were trying to send you a message, or our House or our legislature, and what would that message be? And then I would also ask, how do you talk in those communities to folks about the issues that you are opposing the Trump administration on? How do you explain or share or talk about that with them?
So I certainly listen to all. I will say that in terms of, and particularly the Trump administration, and I'll just take a really great example I used earlier, and that is immigration. Immigration is critically important in terms of Oregon on a number of levels. I think it's important. We are truly, but for our Native American populations, Oregon is a state of immigrants. Most of us came here from somewhere else except for our Native Americans. And the second piece is, I think it is that diverse fabric, diverse cultures that make Oregon such an incredibly unique and special place. People coming from other countries and other states. And we weave this wonderful fabric that we call Oregon. But also, the immigrant communities are very important in terms of our economy as well. So I'll take, for example, agriculture. And one of the reasons why I signed the order to make a very strong statement that we will continue to be a safe, a welcoming and inclusive state is that our agriculture sector is heavily dependent upon immigrant labor. And so there are a couple ways we've talked about that, both with our rural counterparts, but also with the federal administration. When I met with the USDA Secretary, Sonny Perdue, he's a farmer from Georgia, and I explained to him my concerns about the Trump administration policies on the ground, the fear and terror that it is creating in our families, but also, frankly, the impact on some of our sectors, our industry sectors, particularly agriculture. And he knew, as a farmer, he knows the impact. So we're trying to figure out pathways that we can work together with the federal administration in a way that will enable our economy to thrive, but more importantly, to have our families feel safe and comfortable living and being in Oregon.
I want to talk a little bit about your leadership style. So you are the chief executive of the state of Oregon, and you essentially run all of the services for our state. And I want to invite you to talk a little bit about how you are building a world-class leadership team to serve our state? Meaning, what are the skills and experiences that you're looking for in your inner circle, as well as your policy advisors, your agency directors, and those leaders? And how are you preparing our leaders and our state leaders to have the skills to deal with the changes that may be coming our way?
Well, I think that's a really great question, and there's a couple of ways that I would answer it. As governor, I want to make sure that we are delivering state services more effectively and more efficiently and meet the needs of vulnerable Oregonians. So in terms of hiring a world-class team, number one, want to make sure that they are compassionate and committed to serving Oregonians, to public service. Secondly, I'm very interested in building a team that understands what I call principles of diversity and inclusion. And that means from a lot of different perspectives, making sure that we have folks that are reflective of the LGBT community, communities of color, rural communities on our team, that we bring those diverse perspectives to the team. And I'll just share one example. Katie Koba was director of the Department of Agriculture for a number of years, and I asked her to come on as my chief operating officer. Katie grew up in Pendleton. Her father is a wheat rancher, and one of the ways that she was able to look at our budget, I asked her to look at our proposed budget and asked her, is there a way that we are missing rural perspectives in this budget? What are we missing here? So those perspectives I find extremely valuable. And the other piece in terms of diversity and inclusion, I see this not as the icing on the cake, but as the flour as we are baking the cake. And so we bring in principles of diversity and inclusion every step of the way. We do education and training for our team. We are taking action in terms of reaching out and hiring more diverse folks at the state level. And we're also including diversity and inclusion in our policies as well. I'm happy to talk about that as we move to the next question.
For those of you listening on OPB, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Nichole Maher, CEO of Northwest Health Foundation, and I'm honored to be here with Governor Kate Brown, and today our topic is governing during the Trump administration. So I have a follow-up question to a little bit of what you talked about. One of the most common analysis of Trump's victory is really about our country's past and current racial tensions, the difficulty we have as a country talking about that history, and also the growing racial diversity that Oregon and the rest of the United States is experiencing. How are you personally growing your own understanding of structural and systemic racism?
So I do it through reading, through training, and through working with my world-class team that I have brought on board. And I'll just share a story. One of the trainings we did was with Angela Backwell, and she shared a story of activists in the early 70s. And they were folks in wheelchairs and activists for the disability community. And this was before the Americans with Disabilities Act was fully implemented. And in the early 70s, these activists went out and built a curb ramp so that a person in a wheelchair could get up and down the sidewalk. And what Angela said is that curb ramp did an incredible thing. It improved lives for people in wheelchairs, but it also improved lives for every single one of us. For young mothers or young fathers taking children on a walk, the curb ramps or the curb cuts allow you get from one block to another. If you're taking your suitcase on the bus and going to the airport, you can easily roll your suitcase along with you. And if you're a young person or an older person and you like to skateboard, I'm past my skateboarding days, trust me, you can easily move from one block to another with curb cuts. And the point of her story was this. When we meet the needs of our most vulnerable citizens, we all thrive. And so that is the underlying philosophy that I bring to the table, that my focus is on making sure we meet the needs of our most vulnerable communities, and by doing that, Oregon will be a healthier and happier state for all.
So the governor's office holds incredible power. How do you determine what issues and when to use your political capital and your influence? And what are some examples of times when you feel like you've really stepped out?
So I am passionate, Nichole, about many, many things. And so the challenge for me in this job is there are so many places that I feel like I can play a role and make a difference. It's making sure that I focus and channel that energy and that passion appropriately where I can make a difference. So let me just share a couple of pieces. One, healthcare. I talked earlier about how I believe that every Oregonian ought to have access to healthcare. We have done incredible work in the last handful of years with the Affordable Care Act. We now have several 100,000 additional Oregonians that have access to health care, roughly 1 million. It's pretty extraordinary. "98% of children and 95% of adults have coverage." So I used my voice and what power I have as governor very carefully around this issue. Number one, when we saw the Trump proposed health care, that's taking that lightly, I would call it an anti-health care bill, we went and got the data that we needed from the Oregon Health Authority and the Department of Consumer and Business Services really quickly. They compiled that data within 48 hours, and I went to Washington not once, but twice, to meet with members of our delegation, as well as members of the federal administration. And I was able to explain to Secretary Price, number one, the importance of health care to Oregonians. I shared a story that I learned in Klamath Falls. I met with a physician there, and she told me about her patient who had been receiving health care on a regular basis in the emergency room. And with the expansion of the Affordable Care Act, this patient was able to get regular access to care. She was able to get on the Oregon Health Plan, and now she's able to get preventative care. And as a result of preventative care, she is now working. So in addition to providing very valuable health care to Oregonians, it saved both the state and federal administration over $1.6 billion. And in addition to that, we have been able to create over 23,000 jobs across the state as a result of coverage through the expanded population. So that's extraordinary. So we're obviously fighting the Trump administration on their efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act. But the other piece that's really important, I mentioned two stats: 95% of adults are covered and 98% of children are covered. That's important in this component. About 15,000 to 17,000 children in this state do not have health care coverage. I find that absolutely unacceptable. So we are fighting every single day in Salem to make sure that we have the resources to ensure that every single child in this state has access to health care.
I'm going to move the conversation to resources. We are facing significant budget cuts, even if we do pass some revenue reforms. We could also face additional cuts on the federal level to compound our own challenges in Oregon. What are your short-term strategies to deal with our budget shortfall this biennium, and what are your long-term strategies to combat both federal cuts and escalating PERS obligations?
So, short term, in my budget, there are a couple of pieces that I feel very strongly about. Number one, we must reduce the cost growth in state government. And by that, I mean tightening our belts every single step of the way. And so I issued early in the year a hiring freeze. I continued that with my executive order. We have eliminated non-essential travel, and we are working to implement what I would call a more comprehensive statewide effort and aggressive effort around debt collection. In addition to that, we're working with the legislature on a proposal to further increase costs. It's a bipartisan work group came together, and I look forward to seeing that legislation introduced next week, and am cautiously optimistic it will come to my desk. The second piece is PERS, and from my perspective, that's a three-legged stool. Number one, making sure the PERS, the Treasury has adequate staff to ensure that we are maximizing our rate of return on PERS investments. Number two, tackling the unfunded actuarial liability, which is roughly a $20 billion fund. And we just announced a task force this week to help come up with some creative solutions to help reduce that. And the reason why that's important is because if we can reduce it by roughly $5 billion, we will be at 90% stability, and we will be able to reduce employer rates, and I think that's key for funding basic services. And the third piece is a proposal that you'll see introduced shortly in the legislature around cost sharing and risk sharing. So those are two pieces we're working on. That will help us in part with the short-term and the long-term deficit. I put a number of proposals on the table. Some of them are meeting with good legislative reception, and some of them legislators are not so excited about. But one of the things that I think is critically important is coming together around a series of what we call provider taxes to maintain funding for the Oregon Health Plan. A huge portion of our roughly now $1.4 billion deficit is due to the loss of one-time federal funds for the Oregon Health Plan. And so we need to figure out a way to make that up. We're having conversations with hospitals, with insurers, about if we can come together on a proposal that will raise significant dollars to cut that shortfall. I am absolutely committed to not cutting Oregonians off the Oregon Health Plan and not reducing benefits. And this is important because in many times of budget shortfall, we've done exactly that, and I'm not willing to do that. The third piece is, for me, long-term structural deficit, and this is tackling the structural deficit that we have in the state as a result of Ballot Measure 5, passed in 1990, that transferred responsibility of funding schools essentially from the local level to the state level. It comes with a number of ballot measures that we have passed, and we are having conversations every single day with the business community, with the labor community, and with legislators about, is there a sweet spot that we can find that will provide us 18 votes in the Senate and 36 votes in the House, and the broad support of Oregonians.
So this fall, a lot of pressure was put on you by both sides in the Measure 97 ballot measure. The business community didn't like that you supported it. The folks who put the ballot measure forward were frustrated because you didn't support it soon enough. And it didn't pass, and there's a chance that the proposed reforms may not pass this legislative cycle. If we don't pass any reforms in this legislation, how will you lead? What will be your next steps?
I'm not willing to kick this can down the road. So when I ran for the legislature in 1992, my platform was stable and adequate funding for schools. Sound familiar? I also was standing on the shoulders of some of you who you may remember, Senator Shirley Gold, who spent at least a decade in the Oregon legislature working to reform our revenue system. So I am not willing to give up on this one. I have an entire team of folks talking with the business community on a daily basis about what proposals might be acceptable, what will provide a stable system of revenue and enable the business community to pay their fair share, and what is an adequate amount. what does that look like? And I think for me, an adequate amount looks like making sure we invest in our schools and can be proud of a school system that doesn't have one of the shortest school years and one of the largest class sizes. I want to be proud of our school system. I want to make sure we have a system where all of our students can excel. I want to make sure that we provide health care for our citizens, our most vulnerable citizens, and I want to make sure that we are investing in economic development in a way that will enable our economies to thrive, not just in metropolitan Oregon, but in rural Oregon as well.
Well, you took us to the topic of education, and we received an unbelievable number of questions about education in Oregon, and there's a lot of stress about the federal education agenda, but it's also clear that we have a lot of challenges in our own backyard. And in addition to being our governor, you are also our chief superintendent of schools. And what a lot of people don't understand about Oregon is that we are entirely locally controlled in the education sphere, meaning that we have a K through 12 formula, and essentially you have almost 200 different school boards and school districts that make the vast majority of decisions about what happens in our schools. It certainly means that we have some bright spots, but we also have a lot of challenges, and cumulatively, we do have one of the worst graduation rates in the country. And I'd love to hear you talk about your perspective about our K through 12 funding formula and our local control model, and if you think it is really delivering what Oregon's children really need today.
So I just have to share, in terms of Oregon's high school graduation rate, it is absolutely unacceptable. For me, this is a personal issue. My stepson failed to graduate from his high school. Dan and I were really fortunate. We had the resources along with his mom to make sure that he had the support and the services that he needed, but not every family does. And I want to make sure that every student graduates from high school with their plan for their future, whether they want to go to the university, whether they want to have a career, whether they want to go to community colleges, that is up to them, but that they have a plan and that they are ready to compete in our global economy. In terms of our education system more broadly, I'm focused on 3 areas. Number 1, creating a seamless system of education from cradle to career. We knew, Eleanor Roosevelt knew, that the early childhood brain development was absolutely key. We need to make sure that we invest in our early childhood education system in a way that reflects that knowledge that we now have, the science-based information that we now have. We were able to invest in the preschool promise and Head Start last biennium. I am not willing to kick those kiddos and those families off of those programs, because that means that they show up to kindergarten ready to learn. We invested in all-day kindergarten. I will tell you that then Senator, former Justice Betty Roberts, advocated for all-day kindergarten in 1965. In 1965, I signed that bill into law almost 50 years later, in March of 2015. So I'm very committed to creating this seamless system of education, and I know there are folks from community college here in the room. The other piece is that we got 2 tables, the other end as well, so that when students graduate from high school or when they are actually in high school attending community college, that those credits transfer from community colleges onto our university system. And that is not always the case, and that must change. So number 1, creating a seamless system of education from cradle to career. The second piece for me, I mentioned improving our high school graduation rates, and this is where I'm excited about some of the legislation that we've introduced, Senate Bill 183. It creates a graduation equity fund, As a result of Colt Gill's work, and he's our Education Innovation Officer, he toured 32 out of 36 counties, met with students, he met with educators and teachers, he met with parents, he met with business community members, and came up with this package of proposals that would provide specific funding, wraparound services for kids who are struggling in high school, early detection. We know when students are struggling, can we get them the services that they need? Trauma-informed practices so that families have the resources and the support that they need, and also, of course, and very importantly, making sure that students are showing up to school. So we have legislation, Senate Bill 183. I'm wrestling with the legislature on it, but I'm absolutely adamant that we move forward on it and that schools and school districts have the tools they need to improve our high school graduation rate. And the third piece for me is around educator advancement. So when I talk to teachers, and based on the data I've seen, both as the former Secretary of State, some of the auditing work we've done, and also talking to students and the work that Colt did, it's really clear our educators, our teachers are hungry for more coaching, more mentoring, and more professional development. We need to give that to them. The other piece is changing the educator pipeline, making sure that our educators reflect the diverse faces of Oregonians and reflect the different experiences of Oregonians. So that's embodied in Senate Bill 182. I'm still wrestling with the legislature on both of those bills, but I think these three key components are absolutely essential to improving our education system from cradle to career.
So I really appreciate those examples, and I know there's a lot of broad support for those efforts. But I want to reinvite you to think about the bigger question I was asking about kind of local control and our funding formula. I think people are excited about all of the efforts that you mentioned, but the criticism is that it's perceived sometimes as sort of tinkering around the edges or creating a few small programs that might impact very valuable, important kids, but a small number. And I think you would hear from many people across our state that they feel that there are some structural challenges that aren't delivering the best results for our emerging majority of children, which are the children of immigrants, children of color, low-income white children in rural communities, and there's some structural questions. So I would just reinvite you again to reflect on both the formula and our local control model.
So I'll get back to the formula and our local control model, but I have to say, in terms of underserved communities, I believe so strongly in investing in early childhood education. I am well aware of the opportunity gaps that we have in our education system. I believe that we close those opportunity gaps before they have a chance to take root by investing in early childhood education. I think that is absolutely key, and there's a number of other indicators along the way. In terms of our funding formula, I will just say my experience from being in the legislature is that it's really hard to change a funding formula when you don't have enough resources coming in. And I liken it to robbing Peter to pay Paul. And I think our first priority as a state must be to get more resources into our education system as a whole. Then I think you can have conversations about the funding formula. In terms of local control, I will say this. I heard Secretary DeVos said something to the effect of education is like car insurance. I don't think that is my approach. I think it's critically important that we all have really good access to a good public education, because I see education as an elevator. It enables us all to rise. And so for me, there is definitely the tension between local control and state control. And one of the conversations we're having right now in Salem is about the mandates that we pass at the state level without funding at the local level. And one of the mandates, and I'm just going to talk about it because I feel very strongly about it, is Senate Bill 13. And that is weaving Native American curriculum into our education system. So in the Pendleton School District, and they're closely connected, work very closely with the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla there, they have woven tribal history and tribal cultural practices into their educational curriculum. And I was able to attend, I think it was a preschool, it might have been a kindergarten class, where they were learning, all of the students were learning the native language. And I anticipate that you will see in 10 or 20 years higher graduation rates by the Umatilla members of that tribe as a result of that curriculum being woven into the traditional education system. So I feel very strongly that we need to move forward, that we need to have adequate resources in our entire education system, and once we do that, we can certainly have the conversations about our funding formula.
I wanted to take a moment and ask you a question about the incident that happened last week that devastated families, bystanders, and took the life of 2 people and seriously injured another. And I'm so appreciative to our City Club leadership for giving a moment earlier today to really to show honor and respect to what happened. The response has been really challenging, and I think has been reflective of the diverse perspectives that Oregon has. Some folks have recommended that we need to have stronger law and order to respond to the growing number of hate crimes and hate speech in Oregon. You heard other communities who are very upset that the accused in this case was given sort of a lot of excuses about perhaps it was mentally ill, he was mentally ill, whereas when brown and black individuals commit crimes, they're not given that same grace. And the differential way that people were treated, the different perspectives, it just shows where we are as a state in our own challenges in being able to have a conversation about the growing numbers of hate crimes in our state. A lot of communities feel like this has been happening for a long time and is now just being noticed. And in our last few moments before we open it up to questions and answers, I would just invite you to talk about how you lead in this really difficult moment in our state.
Well, I believe in terms of leadership that it is a ground up. I see my role as a public servant, as a servant leader, and so I know that Oregon has a horrendous history in terms of racial injustice. But I think we can move forward and learn from that horrific history and grow and become a better state. And we do that by educating ourselves, talking with one another, and refusing to give in to hatred and violence. And it's going to take all of us working together. I believe that we can do this. If you are concerned about what's happening on the ground, speak out. Give money to causes that contribute to this effort. Show up. Come down to the legislature when we are talking about the racial profiling legislation. Show up. Be there. Use your voices. Give money. And I hope we can work together to create what Dr. King called a beloved community. And one of the experiences I had this year was doing a Shabbat service around Dr. King's memorial. And one of the women that spoke talked about her training as a young activist during the civil rights movement and the efforts that Dr. King put them through to make sure that they would not act violently. And so I think we need to do everything in our power to move forward, create a beloved community, and do it peacefully and gently.
Thank you. For those of you listening on OPB, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Nichole Maher, CEO of Northwest Health Foundation, and I'm here with the Honorable Governor Kate Brown. We are talking about governing during the Trump administration, and at this moment, we will be moving on to our audience question and answers. If you've written a question on an index card, hold it high for staff to collect. You can also submit questions through Twitter using the hashtag Friday Forum. I'll try and read at least one index card and one question from Twitter. We invite members of City Club to ask their questions at the microphone. Asking a question is a privilege of City Club, and City Club membership is open to everyone. Please identify yourself as a City Club member and ask one question, and I emphasize question, in 30 seconds or less. Thank you.
Governor Brown, my name is Tom Dyke. I'm a member of City Club, and I'm also a member of the City Club's Earthquake Resilience Research Committee, which issued its report in February, Big Steps Before the Big One, which had 14 recommendations concerning improving earthquake resilience in the Portland metro area. And we hope you've had a chance to look at that report, and we'd love to share our recommendations with you concerning building safety, social resilience, and energy infrastructure. In other words, the tank farm just north of here. I also want to thank you for signing House Bill 2140, the Seismic Disclosure for Real Estate bill.
Excuse me, sir. We're limited to one question.
Yeah, I've only got one question, actually. And that question is, how do you see your role as governor in raising awareness on these issues of earthquake resilience?
I think what I heard is that how do I see my role as governor in raising issues around earthquake resilience? I see it as multiple fold. Number one, working regularly to ensure that Oregonians are prepared in the event of a seismic event. And that means having 14 days worth of food, non-perishable food, and 14 days of water in your safe unit. And that means 1 gallon per person. And I'm just curious in the audience how many people have their preparedness kit all put together. For our listening audience, it's actually a really impressive show of hands. Maybe we're goofing a little bit on it. So that's the first piece. The second piece, and we brought on Mike Harriman, our Chief Resiliency Officer, to connect with our Office of Emergency Management to work with our local jurisdictions to develop stronger and better partnerships around preparedness. And one of the exciting programs I'm excited about is our cross-county program that allows counties like Union or Umatilla and Tillamook to partner in the event of an earthquake. The other, obviously, the non-impacted county would be their lifeline. So we're building those partnerships. And the third piece for me is making sure from an infrastructure standpoint, we are resilient in the event of a Cascadia earthquake. And so that means ensuring our roads and bridges are resilient, and also ensuring that we have an alternative transportation route. So examples, we're having a conversation right now about our transportation package. There are 135 bridges on the coast. 100 of them will be either completely destroyed or severely damaged in a 9.0 earthquake. We need to make sure that we provide the resources to seismically retrofit those roads and bridges. So those are the 3 steps we're working on.
I'm going to go ahead and take a question that I received on Twitter, which is I'm incredibly grateful for because I didn't get to any of my environmental questions earlier. Will you join the U.S. Climate Alliance with Washington, California, and New York? And I will add, how do you plan to lead after we quit the Paris Treaty?
So my team has been working for the last 6 months on the U.S. Climate Alliance. Those 3 states are the co-chairs. We will continue to participate on the Climate Alliance, and we are doing everything we can to ensure that we are taking the steps that Oregon needs to tackle global climate change. Future generations are... Future generations will judge us not on the fact of global climate change, but what we do to tackle it. And we are taking a number of steps. Since I became governor, I signed into law the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which reduces the carbon intensity of our transportation fuels. I signed into law the Coal to Clean, which was a collaborative effort between the environmental community and the utilities community to reduce fossil fuel energy use, but specifically to move Oregon off of coal by 2030 and increase the reuse of our renewable resources by 2040. We are moving forward on a handful of items. Number one, reducing building energy use. Buildings, residential and commercial, comprise about 30% of our electricity use. So it's absolutely imperative that we take the steps needed to reduce our building energy consumption. Legislation didn't move forward. I'm using the tools that I have in my executive toolkit to move forward on that. We are working on a transportation package that invests in electrical vehicle infrastructure, that invests in pedestrian and bicycle pathways, and also invests in public transit. And I see this as key for building a thriving, productive Oregon. So I'll leave it at that.
Next question from the audience, please.
Thank you. Jesse Beeson, City Club member. The dog whistle politics of the Trump administration around law and order has been most recently exemplified by Attorney General Jeff Sessions' recent directive that prosecutors use the fullest extent of the law to charge the most serious crimes. But Oregon is also not immune from this kind of horrible criminal justice practices, whether it's Measure 11 or 57, or any of the number of studies that have showed that disproportionately we are using our criminal justice system to affect communities of color. My question is, how much of a priority are the many bills passing through the legislature to address some of these disparities for your office?
It is absolutely a priority for me that our criminal justice system be fair and just. And one of the bills that we are working on, and I see the Attorney General is here today, we're partnering with the Attorney General on, is our racial profiling legislation. It implements the recommendations of the Attorney General's task force around data collection, but it also does a very important thing, and the data came from our Criminal Justice Commission, and that is a reduction of the sentencing for possession of a controlled substance from a felony to a misdemeanor. As an example, the Criminal Justice Commission came to me with the data showing that young men of color, African American and Latino men, are disproportionately impacted by a felony from a possession of a controlled substance. If we can lower that to a misdemeanor, and I'm cautiously optimistic that we can move forward on that legislation, that will start to eradicate some of the disparities that we see in our criminal justice system. In addition, we need to continue the work we're doing around criminal justice reinvestment. That was legislation that passed while I was in the Secretary of State's office, but essentially reducing time and using those dollars to invest in people, in successful transition programs, in preventative programs, so folks don't end up in the criminal justice system to begin with. In addition, I think there are some really common sense policies that we can move forward on, and I have to credit my superintendent of the Oregon State Police, Travis Hampton. They are having a new policy now around taillights being out. And instead of giving people a ticket for taillights, they're giving out a coupon from the local auto store so that people can go get a headlight for tail light, right? That's the kind of common sense policies that we need. And we can go on in terms of the judicial system and the legal system, but I assume someone will ask that question as well.
Next question, please.
Thank you. Anthony Petchel, City Club member. I'm with Reach Community Development, affordable housing provider, and thank you for your strong support of affordable housing. The Trump administration's budget in a lot of ways, wages war against the poor by gutting critical social service safety net that exists in our country. What are you doing as governor to strengthen Oregon's social safety net beyond healthcare?
Safety net system of nonprofits. I think my commitment is ensuring that our vulnerable citizens have the services that they need. You mentioned affordable housing. This is a huge challenge for every single community across the state. So I met 2 days ago with a number of folks in the affordable housing communities, a number of the nonprofit organizations, and they are begging for additional dollars to prevent homelessness in the first place. We invested an additional $10 million last biennium to prevent homelessness. I am hoping we can get some more resources to prevent homelessness this next biennium. But those dollars go directly to the nonprofit community to help keep people in their rental apartments or their rental homes. So that's the kind of work we are doing. Generally around affordable housing, my package includes roughly 2,000 additional affordable units. Those are targeted on underserved communities and rural communities, and building on the work we did last biennium, and working to make sure that our local jurisdictions have the tools that they need to prevent homelessness and encourage partnerships and collaborations about providing more affordable housing. So, thank you.
Next question, please.
Carol Witherell, City Club member. I have heard a panel of 10 people from schools that are using restorative justice practices and SUN programs and other wraparound services that have made a tremendous difference in their graduation rates, school climate, et cetera. So that's an upstream approach. But what is preventing us from bringing those programs throughout all of our school districts in Oregon, because they make such a difference in students and community lives?
Why are we doing a back-end approach? Thank you. So I talked earlier about my approach to education and creating the seamless system of education. And the reason why I am so committed to early childhood education is I am a lawyer. I'm a lawyer in recovery. I used to practice in the foster care system, representing parents and children in the foster care system. And I saw what happened when families were exposed to domestic violence, to substance abuse, to homelessness. And that's why I believe so critically that we must invest in early childhood education, not just at 3- and 4-year-olds, but from pre-K, from prenatally, and from the moments babies are born. So it's making sure that families have the wraparound services that they need. It's making sure that if parents need parenting assistance, that they can get their support. It means home visitation and expanding our ability to provide home visitation services, all of those pieces. And then if parents are struggling with domestic violence or drug and alcohol treatment, making sure we have the services available so that they can get the treatment that they desperately need.
We'll take one last question from the audience.
Chris Andre, City Club member. Thank you so much for this. It's really provided a forum and a picture of what Portland looks like, which is wonderful to see. I want to return to the question of earthquake preparedness and disaster preparedness in general. Preparedness seems to address the results of a disaster, but what about not letting it happen in the first place? Jordan Cove, places like that. Don't put an LNG terminal where you know it's on sand and there's going to be an earthquake. Wouldn't it be smarter to just to prevent it in the first place?
Jordan Cove? I'm not sure I heard what you said.
It's more about disaster preparedness.
Okay. Okay, all right. Thank you. I'm sorry I didn't hear the question. So I'll focus on disaster preparedness more broadly. I mentioned earlier Mike Harriman, our Chief Resiliency Officer, is working with local jurisdictions, partnering with cities and counties to make sure that they have the tools and the resources they need. The second piece for us is making sure that our infrastructure is prepared, and this goes specifically to Jordan Cove. I will say that I know that the White House believes that they have the power and the siting authority around Jordan Cove. That is not the case. It's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission will make the decision about siting Jordan Cove. And my encouragement to audience members would be to contact your federal delegation and express your concerns or your support of that particular project. As governor, my role is to make sure that state statutes are enforced, that regulations are complied with, and that Oregonians have an opportunity to be heard in that process. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor. It's been a privilege to visit with you today.
We're out of broadcast time. I need to stop today. A big thank you to Nichole Maher, our moderator today, also to Walter Robinson of the Friday Forum Committee, and of course, thank you to the Honorable Governor Brown and her team for being here today. I'm Courtney Nelson. We are adjourned.